One thing I am doing is I'm the outsider. I'm the outsider coming in and taking a look at Coney. And I've got my positioning statement and I've got my real world example from the last month. So my positioning statements of what you guys do is you drive great business outcomes fueled by mobile apps. Great business outcomes fueled by mobile apps. That's one person's impression. Your job is to figure out what those great business outcomes are in terms of what your customer wants. And as it was said many times, if they're not measuring it, they're not going to invest in it. If they're not measuring it, it's not an urgent enough problem for them to fix. So your job is to qualify and ask those kinds of questions. You're selling innovation. You're looking at customers who have significant problems they've had for a while, and your job, if you're really selling innovation well, and I'll give you multiple examples, is to figure out a way for them to fix that problem faster and more efficiently than the current way they do. And that takes a lot of understanding of what their business requirements are. That takes a lot of understanding how they're measuring stuff. So the points you're hearing so far are critical to you being able to get inside that customer's head, understand what the top 3 pain points are, and begin solving them. I have started and invested in countless companies. And the one thing that drives every single one of them is understanding how to get the customer to open their wallet and part with their money. Because that's the ultimate measurement of success. That's the goal line. There's a whole lot of work that's completely underappreciated that goes behind that, getting that customer to reach inside and metaphorically start handing you money. You have to, in today's world, be extremely strategic. You have to understand the business issues. And if you're going to beat the current way they do it and your current competition, you have to be better than the next guy in knowing how to do that. So again, just to reinforce, I started in sales. I worked for companies that had never had a salesperson before. I've worked for companies where I didn't have anything but a telephone and a list. And the good news was most of these companies were innovative. And I learned pretty early that if I want to work my funnel and get my velocity up, I had to quickly qualify people, and if they weren't qualified, politely move on. I'm dating myself a little bit, but my first sales job was with Lotus Development. We were selling a product called 123. We could not build the stuff fast enough. And I was given the luxury of selling to Fortune 500 accounts in the Northeast region of the United States. And I had to learn to say no in the politest way to people who wanted to sit there and spend a lot of time with me but weren't interested in buying. I have about 20 different ways of very politely saying no and making them feel good about it. It's probably the best skill set I ever learned. And when somebody's interested, I'm immediately qualifying them in a very professional way. But if I can show people how much or how smart I am or how strategic I am frequently by the questions I ask them. Interesting problem. Have you found a way to solve it? What's your satisfaction level with that solution? If you had it to do over again, what would you do? These are very open-ended questions asked in a very professional way, and you build credibility simply by the questions you're asking. Let's talk about what customers do when they're buying. First of all, they don't buy products. They don't buy products, they don't buy services. What they do is they fix a business problem. They fix problems that are urgent and they're willing to pay for. When I say urgent, if the problem you're fixing for your customer isn't in their top 3 things they got to do this quarter, it's probably not urgent enough. And it's probably time to politely move on and call that customer back the next quarter, or take them out to lunch, or do whatever the appropriate way to interact with that customer is and follow up. Interestingly, I know last quarter you're working on this, this, and this. I understand, go look up what happened to the company in the last quarter. This happened and that happened. Have those priorities changed at all? Okay, a very open-ended, intelligent way of probing and showing how much value you're adding to what they're doing. If they're not fixing the problem today, somehow, they're not going to buy your product. Nobody is sitting around waiting for somebody to say, gee, I'd love a way to get my stuff on mobile. I'd love a way to make my apps mobile really quickly. They're not sitting there waiting for that to happen. If it's an urgent problem, they're fixing it today. Your job is to show them how much easier it can be, how much quicker it can be, how much more thorough it can be. Question to them, how do you fix this problem today? If the answer is we don't, it's not in their top 3 things they got to fix, move on, call them back next quarter. If you don't know what their problem is or how they fix it today, you got to do more work to earn the right to propose what you're doing. Too many salespeople come in and say, let me tell you about my products. And I'm going to take my square peg and I'm going to try to jam it into your round hole. The more strategic salespeople, who are really good business people at heart, say, let me understand what your issues are, and if there's a fit, I'll go and propose the fit once I've earned the right to do that. But if there's not, just stay in touch with that person and continue to follow up. Obvious one, if your product was easy to sell, we wouldn't need all the people in the room here selling it, right? Nothing involves order taking in this business. The dollar volumes are too high, the economic value is too high, you have incredible support organizations behind all your sales efforts. That's just reflective of the kind of solutions you're selling. You got to do the work to earn the right to present your solution. You don't just go in with your 6 guns a-blazing talking about all the great products you have. You stop, you ask questions, you listen thoughtfully, and sometimes you walk away and come back if it's appropriate. Interesting set of problems. Let me go back to the ranch, work with my people, and come back with a solution. Or, if there's an obvious solution, obviously you can present it, but don't lead with your product. Lead with understanding what the business, what issues the customers have. And, you know, this isn't new to you. You see this a lot in Medic, the system you guys use, and we're going to, you know, sort of map those things back to the Medic process. Now, I'm about to give you a visual that represents a significant and urgent pain. This might be a little out there, but what's this, right? This is a mouse infestation. I want you to think of this metaphor when you're looking for problems. If you find somebody who has this problem, you've got a customer with a high sense of urgency. Now the question is, are they going to pick you? And how do you convince them of that? The problem is obvious and the need is compelling. Well, guess what? This is what all the salesmen are going to try to show up with, right? And they're not going to say, tell me about your problem. They're going to say, hey, let me tell you about my neat mouse hand grenade. Or let me tell you that bottom left one about my high-tech mouse solution. Or the upper right-hand side, let me tell you about my humane way of taking care of mice. These are what typical salespeople are going to sell. And all I want to be in this kind of situation is the guy who has that. Because that and a jar of peanut butter is probably going to fix most of the problem. It's your job to know the problem, know what the options are, and know how your solution fits relative to the customer. What does this all mean? There was a guy named Ralph Waldo Emerson. He lived in the late 1800s. And back in those days, if you did build a better mousetrap, the world would beat a path to your door. But that's simply not the case anymore. I spent a lot of my life working on these kinds of customer problems. I built companies based on customer problems. I took the skill set I learned in sales, and before I started companies, I would talk to personally and interview aggressively at least 100 people in my target market. I made sure I was fixing problems with a high sense of urgency, a defined market, and people were willing to pay for. This guy had it a little easier back in the late 1800s or late 19th century. But one of the things sitting on your desk right now is a book I wrote. When I did go get a PhD, I researched this aggressively. The data shows that when a product doesn't sell or a company goes out of business, 85% of the time it's market-related issues. It's not understanding the customer's problem well enough. It's typically not understanding what the alternatives were. It's underestimating how entrenched the competition is. It's underestimating how much competition is doing nothing. And it's understanding that customers frequently don't get paid to take risks. They get paid to fix their they get ahead by fixing their problems. So again, the better mousetrap theory simply does not work in this century, and I know all of you know that from experience based on the customers you're dealing with. If we had listened to the customer back when the horse was the main mode of transportation, and we asked the customer what they wanted, what would they have said? Faster horse. Exactly. So there's a guy named Henry Ford who heard this, and let's go back to that time frame. There were dozens and dozens and dozens of car companies. I think there were 30 to 40 different car companies. They all catered to the high end of the market. Basically, car builders made car frames, and they sent them off to a coach builder who built the body. So unless you had all kinds of money, you didn't get a car. Henry Ford didn't invent the car. He did, however, figure out a way to make it affordable. This is actually a picture of a 1908 Model T. Didn't invent the car, but what he realized was most people couldn't afford one. And if they were given an alternative to a horse, they'd be willing to buy one. So what did he do? He was an innovator. He didn't listen to what the customer said and that they wanted a faster horse. He listened to what their business problem was. And what was his innovation? What did he do? Came up with mass production. He came up with an assembly line process. So rather than hand-built stuff and use different screws on each different car, he had a systematic way of cars shooting down an assembly line and people assembling them. Now, what he set as a goal was he wanted the people working on his assembly line to be able to afford the product they were building. He's one of the few surviving car makers. Of the 30 or 40 that were there, he's one of 3 domestic car makers still in the market. So he did not invent this stuff. He simply used competitive advantage, which I'm going to talk more about, to move the price down, because in the automotive market at that point in time, price was an issue and dramatically expanded the market. This guy was so cheap. What he would do, and here's a picture of an early assembly line, he would actually order car engines. The car engines came in from an outsourced manufacturer. There were people that specialized in car engines at the time. And believe it or not, cars were built with a lot of wood at the time. The floorboards and many other parts were wood. So he would specify, he got so into this, he would specify to the engine makers what wood to pack the engines in that were shipped to him. And then his worker would disassemble the engine crates, take the boards, and put them in the car. At the time, completely innovative. Today, standard operating procedure. So I want you to think, how can you take the problem you're dealing with, the customer problem you're dealing with, and fix it in a different way? If you ask the customer, they're not going to say it. They will describe the problem they have, but they're not going to know the solution. It's your job as people selling innovation to understand what the customer problem is and what Coney can do to fix it, because that's where the magic gets made. If you can get to that point, your credibility is sky high, price is not the issue, and they will view you as a partner. Since we're dealing with a bunch of salespeople and sales organizations and support organizations, I have one other quote, not particularly relevant to the point I'm making here, but it's a famous Henry Ford quote, and that is, you can have any color you want as long as it's black. Everybody wanted custom everything, and his take was, hey, you want a different color, go down and pay 20x the price of this thing and get whatever color you want. If you want my car, any color as long as it's black. Also, he had a very good PR department. He was a raging communist. He was a raging racist. But, you know, we've kind of remade him over the centuries. So highly innovative. All right. So again, not the customer's job to find the solution, customers should be able to describe the problem. Your job is to come in with an innovative solution. Let's look at another obvious example you're all familiar with. I don't know how many of you remember these gems from Nokia, BlackBerry, and Motorola. Any of you have kids know they don't even know the names of those companies anymore. So these were the original smartphones. They had all the functionality of today's smartphones, and were on the market for 2 or 3 years before a company named Apple jumped in, right? It had all the functionality. There were cameras, and there were actually early mapping systems, and there were all kinds of features, but none of them really succeeded. On the other hand, Apple had never built a phone in its life, had no idea what it was doing. So what did Apple do? It took its competitive advantage, user experience, usability, integration, support, and it applied it in a market it literally knew nothing about. And I'd argue at least half of you in the room have a smartphone today, if not more than that. So Steve Jobs was a genius at letting markets evolve to a degree, and we'll talk more about this in a minute, similar to the way Henry Ford did, and then innovating. And instead of innovating around price, like Ford did, he innovated around design, quality, usability. So first of all, Apple went from being a computer company to making something called an iPod, to cannibalizing the iPod market with its own smartphones, to moving into tablets. They did the exact same thing in the tablet market. There were 50 or 60 players in the tablet market before the iPad came out. All Apple had to do, they didn't say, here's an iPad, or here's a tablet computer, and here's why you want it. All Apple had to do was say, hey, you know that tablet market? We now have a version of it. So they used their competitive advantage, which in this case was a better product, to dominate the market. Let's look at Steve Jobs' famous quote. It's not the customer's job to know what they want. It's not. Your customers aren't sitting there, gee, I'd love a platform where I could build my mobile apps once and get it to run in all kinds of environments and fit the screens and do all the things your products are capable of. It's your customer's job to know that they're behind in certain areas. They've got to find a better way to produce things more efficiently. Now, the other thing is, Steve is also credited with a little bit of customers don't know what they want until I tell them. That's actually not the case. I actually worked with Steve Jobs in the 1980s in his first run through Apple. And what he was great at was understanding what customers wanted and understanding what Apple could deliver. So if the customer has a problem, there might be a dozen ways to fix that problem. Steve knew what he could deliver through Apple's competitive advantage, through its design, through its usability, through its support aspect. So he was a master at stitching the two together. He'd listen to customers, he'd go back to his mad scientist lab, come up with a product. The customer never would have described that product, but when he went back to the customer, they knew it fixed its problems. I want you to do that. I want you to listen to what the customer problem is, understand all the metrics, because in today's world, if they're not measuring it, it's not a problem. If somebody's not gold on it, it's not a problem. You've got to do all that qualification and go back with a solution. Obviously, that solution is going to leverage Coney's products and services, but I want you to think like Steve Jobs. Quick MBA lesson. If you look at how to compete in a market, there's one of two things you do. One is you either become the low-cost provider, like Ford did through its assembly line process. That does not mean you're the cheapest to the customer. That just means your costs are the lowest internally. Doesn't translate to discounted products or cheap products. Number one, you become the low-cost provider. Or number two, you become the value-added provider. You do things in a better way with more service and support that customers are willing to pay for. So let's look at an example of a low-cost provider today. Not the cheapest to buy, but an example. And here's a quote from Herb Kelleher of Southwest Airlines. How many of you have not flown on Southwest Airlines? Okay, we have a good international contingent here. So Southwest Airlines has the lowest cost per passenger mile of anyone in the industry in the domestic United States. Got to target my market here because once we begin flying over oceans, there are different things customers buy. But what Herb Kelleher says, and if you ever meet this guy, he's a riot. If he were up here now, he'd be drinking whiskey and smoking cigarettes, even if the fire marshal walked in. All right, so his take is, we're not in the airline business, we're in the service business. By chance, we happen to fly airplanes. So for those of you who fly Southwest, what's their tagline? You're laughing at that. That's a good sign. What is it? Transparency, bags fly free, no switching charges. They are the lowest cost provider. How do they do that? Classic business school stuff, right? First of all, they fly point to point versus hub and spoke. If there's a flood in Houston and they got to shut down the Houston airport, it does not bring down the whole Southwest Airlines system. Any of you fly, all of you fly, I'm sure, and particularly in the domestic U.S., you know the worst thing is connections. Southwest Airlines connections are bulletproof. They do fast turns on their planes, right? That thing rolls up, somebody hits a stopwatch, and they're literally timing people on how quickly they get off, how quickly they get on. They only have one plane model, right? It's a Boeing 737, so all the pilots know how to fly it, all the mechanics know which light bulbs burn out the most, all the flight attendants know what to do. What else do they do? No food. You want food, go down to McDonald's and bring the food on board. No moans about it. We're just flying you somewhere. Also, getting food on and off an airplane takes a lot of time. And if that asset is not in the air flying, it doesn't make any money. They have great labor relations. Somebody mooed, it's a cattle call, at the same time everybody laughed. That's classic Southwest Airlines. No inter-airline baggage transfer. If you're flying on another airline, you got to pick up your stuff and carry it yourself. Why? Because they lose too many bags that way and it costs too much time and money. There's only one place to get tickets, Southwest Airlines. They do fuel hedging. They do all kinds of things that reduce their costs. So they are the lowest cost provider in the industry. They are not the cheapest to fly. But what this strategy does is it lets them do two things. Number one, if they charge standard rates on a particular route, their costs are lower than their competitors, so they make more money. Or if they want to get into a route, it's a commodity item, they lower the costs to industry standard profitability, and they get market penetration because it's a commodity product. That is their competitive differentiation. They don't talk about that. They don't say, hey, we fly one kind of, they don't talk about all the stuff behind the scenes that adds up to something. What do they say? They say transparency. That matters to customers. They say bags fly free. That matters to customers, right? Their competitive advantage is low-cost provider. If tomorrow people didn't care about paying for bags and they wanted free booze on the airplane, they could do that in a heartbeat. Why? Because they make more money than anybody else. But I want to emphasize, they don't talk about it to the market. They tell customers what is important to them. So part of what I'm emphasizing here is you guys have lots of resources behind you. You have lots of complicated stuff you're able to do, a lot of technical things you do. It's not your job to talk about that to the customer. It's your job to talk about how you're fixing the customer's problem and why they want to go with you. You don't have to go into technical depth when you're dealing with the business problem. Obviously, eventually you're going to do it, and you're going to have deployment schedules and everything else, but don't sell that. Sell your understanding of what's going on and your ability to innovate for that customer to make them more competitive. A few more things on Southwest Airlines just to drive home the point. First of all, if you feel bad about your industry, if you feel you get beat up by customers, how'd you like to be in this industry? Pennies are manhole covers in the airline industry, right? Southwest Airlines is the only legacy U.S. carrier that has not been through bankruptcy. And as I tell my kids and my MBA students and anyone looking for a job, do not go into an industry where bankruptcy is a regular part of the financing strategy, right? You guys are in a much better place than the airline industry, trust me. Technical reason is behind it, they don't generate enough return on equity to cover their cost of capital. For those of you into that kind of thing, their return on equity is about 5.4% annualized. Their cost of capital is about 5.6% annualized. Therefore, they're losing 0.2% annually as an industry. Therefore, they have to go into bankruptcy. If any of you are selling to an airline, you better know that, because that's part of the business problem you can help fix, as evidenced by Saudi Airlines. You've got to be facile enough with these details to be able to talk about what matters to the customer. Quick strategy lesson. Michael Porter, some of you know who that is. He's the strategy guru. You either have to be the cost leader or the benefit leader. Southwest Airlines with cost leadership or Apple with benefit leadership. Southwest dominates in their space. They make tons of money. They're the cost leader. Apple dominates in its space. They're the benefit leaders. They're highly profitable. So that's a summary on strategy. Are you Southwest Airlines as cost leadership, or are you the benefits leader as Apple? So my question, what is Coney? Of those two strategies, what is it? Benefits. Does Apple sell on price? No. Should you guys sell on price? No. Guess what? You can pick up a Macintosh computer at Walmart. You pay just as much to get it at Walmart as you do it at an Apple store. You do not sell on price. You guys sell on benefits. To sell on benefits, you got to get inside that customer's head and understand everything about their industry. Okay. Very good. You all get an A on that first quiz. All right. Let's talk about what's going on inside your space and why is this a huge opportunity for Coney and for all of you as individuals to differentiate yourself to your customer. This is what's called the product life cycle. I'm going to give you some little bit of strategy behind this. Right now, mobile computing is past the introduction phase at the bottom left-hand corner, right? It used to be, it was hard to get a connection, and connections didn't hold, and your system shut off, and not everybody had a smartphone. And in most of the developed world, and all your customer bases, we're well past that introduction phase. We're actually in the growth phase. So what happened during that growth phase? So first of all, in that introduction phase, that's a cowboy running ahead of arrows coming after them. You have to run really, really fast. And you have to hustle, and you sell to innovators, to early stage adopters. It's a small piece of the market. 2 or 3% of customers are usually available in that introduction phase. The growth phase is where you come in with competitive advantage. This is where Ford Motor got established, this is where Apple got established, and this is where Southwest Airlines got established. All of a sudden, growth was king. Ford was able to sell cars to people who worked on its assembly line. Southwest Airlines, when they got started, if you talk to Herb Kelleher, airline travel was for the rich or people traveling on business, and that was it. Now it's everywhere. So they took advantage. They did not invent airline travel, nor cars, nor smartphones, but they used their competitive advantage to grab market share. You guys are in the exact same place. It's growing really fast. That's your sales right there. And what do you need to do? You need to qualify your customers. If they're not ready, you got to move on. I'm not saying get rid of that customer, but keep that contact and follow up and move on to the next one. Because there's somebody else out there with a high sense of urgency that you got to keep cycling through. You got to up that velocity. So how do you sell to your customer? It's a lot of work. If it was easy, we wouldn't need this room of support. We wouldn't need this room of service people, of lead generation people, of sales people. If it was easy, you could just put up a website and talk about what you did, and in theory, people would find you. It's just not how your market, your products work. So it's really hard work. Customers don't know what they want. Talked about that from Steve Jobs. If you ask customers what they want, they'll give you a false read. If you ask customers what they want, they'll tell you they want a faster horse. They'll tell you they want cheaper airfare, but they want high customer service. They're going to be very confused in what they tell you, and you can't rely on that to build products. I can tell you that from experience. Your job as an innovator is to get inside your customer's brain, figure out how you can fix that problem using Coney's differentiation that takes advantage of Coney's competitive advantage, which again has nothing to do with price and everything to do with benefit. How do you do this? The headlines are, you never propose your product until you understand everything about the customer. And obviously to do that, you got to understand everything about your customer. And that's part of the exercises we're going to do. We're going to focus on MEDDIC. But before we do that, I'm going to break a few urban myths. Life is not easy. Success is not easy. What am I going to do? The problem I have is there's something I call business pornography. And that is, if you pick up a magazine or go to a website, they describe in 2 or 3 paragraphs how life was easy for Facebook. They make it sound like Mark Zuckerberg was getting drunk in his dorm one night, he bumped his head, he rolled out to Silicon Valley, raised a bunch of money, and took it public. This is a 12-year overnight success story. How did they start? They had that same product life cycle we saw, right? What was for extra bonus points, what was Facebook's first target market? Harvard University. First target market. They said, our strategy is we're not going to expand our market till we get 60% share. And by the way, Facebook was not a new idea on any university. Every university had it. It was the incoming freshman register or it was the outgoing senior register, but it was a physical book. And it was called a Facebook. So what they did was they said, we're going to dominate on the Harvard campus till we get enough market share. What was their second target market? Ivies, very good. Ivy League schools. We're going to keep that elite, I got to have it, but I won't let you have it thing. So the second thing they did was Ivies, the Ivy League universities. You had to have an Ivy League extension. What was the third thing they did? Any educational institution. So they systematically went after individual markets, and they were able to build a sense of exclusivity. They didn't waste their time on anyone who didn't fit their target market. And then what they did was they got a bunch of vertical markets, and eventually they took off. They held back. They were careful, and they cultivated an image. Now, the other thing is, the thing that I find annoying is, again, if you're under 30 and not a billionaire, you must be behind the curve. Nothing I can do about that, but it took Facebook a long time to be successful. Now, the other challenge Facebook had was their customers were unwilling to pay. 3 things you need to have a good customer. One is high sense of urgency. Second thing, or a good company. Second thing is you have to have a target market. Third thing is they have to be willing to pay. This market has never been willing to pay. They've tested it. It hasn't worked. So they had to figure out another way to generate revenue. And their business problem was figuring out how to generate revenue. Eventually they cracked it, but it took them about 7 or 8 years as background. So don't be fooled. It's a lot of work. Here's my requisite sports analogy. All right, how many of you wanted to play in the NFL? Some of you might have played in the NFL. Think life's pretty easy in it. It's not. All right? This guy is catching his first pass for the Chicago Bears. The thing I dislike about sports is when you see somebody who's really good at it, they make it look simple. They make it look very straightforward. They make it look overly simplistic. Why? Because they spent the last 15 years of their lives, in this case, doing this. Let's just look at some stats. 15 years of playing, average daily caloric intake of 5,000 calories, 2,000 hours in physical rehab. 2,000 hours is 1 working year. 6,000 hours of weightlifting, that's 3 working years. 12 Wonderlic intelligence tests. 30 random drug tests. Captain of the college team. Turned down a Rhodes Scholarship during the NFL strike to be a walk-on the NFL. That meant being 6 months of being a janitor. Every play in the NFL by every player, no matter who they are, gets 3 grades. Technique, execution, and strength. They get rated every day, Monday or Tuesday, in front of their peers. During the season, they work about 80 hours a week. This includes 3 hours a night memorizing a playbook on your own. The playbook changes every week. These are complicated plays. These are 3-inch binders. Other interesting trivial stuff. I don't know if you know this, but if you take an NFL salary, player's salary, you divide it by 15 weeks they play. And then, if they play in a state with income tax, they are forced to pay income tax in that state for 1 week. So 80, 90% of them make league minimum. You only hear about the big ones. Most of them are really working men who happen to be doing something they love. So the other thing here is, although this looks pretty simple, he knows that his eyes have to look one way because the defender's trying to see where he's going. His hips have to go the other way because the defender's looking at his hips. And he's moving the ball back and forth to further confuse the defense. Although this looks like a great picture here, there's about 8 things going on simultaneously that he's trained his whole life for. So nothing in life is easy. And I'll give you another quote from Thomas Edison, very apropos. And it's been, as you can tell by some of these older quotes, this has been the way business has been for a long time. I love it. Opportunity is missed by most people because it's dressed in overalls and looks like work. So go back to your customer base, go dig in again, go ask them the questions again, be professional about it. You can show somebody how smart you are by the questions you're asking them and the attention you're paying them. All right, a little bit on customer validation. If this is what the customer wants, this is what most companies deliver, right? I want a knife. I should go find people who want knives. Instead, the company will build 80 things inside a knife and say, hey, there's one of these as a knife. Your job is to be more refined than that. Your job is to figure out who needs the knife on the left, not who needs the catch-all solution on the right. How are we going to fix all this? I'm going to give you a process for innovation around customer validation. I'm going to take all the things we talked about and use MEDDIC to figure out how to apply them in your accounts. There's also a book sitting on your tables. This book covers customer and market validation, something I've hung my hat on, something I've used to make startup companies succeed. Average success ratio in a startup is 20%. I've been able to use this effectively and get my hit rate up to about 27, 28, 29%, almost 30%. You heard Blake say 10% increase in your transactions is going to dramatically increase your quota performance. It's usually the small things like that that can make a dramatic difference in what you're doing. And the other thing, the idea behind this that has worked very effectively for me is failing fast. As someone who's done many startups and has done them for a living, I'm very unemotional. If it's not going to work, I'm going to take a bullet and shoot it and take the people and the money and the talent and move on to the next opportunity. The difference here is I don't think you have to shoot your customers. I think you have to put them on the callback list 3 or 6 months and check back in with them. All right, top of the funnel. Let's talk about ready. If you pull out your workbooks, we're going to be doing a little bit of work here at the end of the ready session. I'm going to give you 5 minutes. After we cover all this, I'm going to ask you at your tables to fill this out on an opportunity you agreed to at the table. And then We've got a series of microphones posted. I'm going to ask various teams to get up and give us their version. Now, also, this is group participation. It's a little hard to do in a group this size. If you have ideas or thoughts about what I'm talking about, shout them out. Because the good news is we're all on the same team. We're all trying to close customers. And the more ideas we can get, the more stuff we can put in front of the customer, the smarter and more consultative we can look as innovators selling innovation, the more products and services Coney is going to be able to move in the market. And by the way, I also caught something Blake said today, and I wish sales organizations did this when I was around. Your support system and your lead generation system is so good, it's unbelievable. You have such a chain to be able to sort of help at the front end of this funnel, this top part, this ready part. So let's talk about ready. And as you know from Medic, this applies to the metrics and identifying the pain. So why is this relevant? These are the 5 points I'm going to take you through. Understanding the customer. And my point is customers don't buy products or services. They fix business problems. So when we talk about this stuff, you're not allowed to say anything about Coney. You're not allowed to say anything about what you do or how you do it or whether it's a product or whether it's a service. You are strictly understanding what the customer's problem is. Why? Because good vendors don't sell products or services. They fix urgent business problems. Again, you want a value-added approach, understand the customer problem, understand what kind of customers have it, and position your products and services to reinforce your competitive advantage. Item number 1, understanding the customer. How does the customer define the problem? Doesn't mean how does Coney hope they define the problem. It means what does the customer define as a problem? If you're dealing with an IT organization, what are your top 3 issues? I'm working with another company right now, and I actually had a call set up with the VP of Information Technology. And he was traveling, and he asked for me to have the call with him on his cell phone. This guy is so inundated with vendors that I called him precisely on time, right, out of respect for his time. I called him, and I got his voicemail. Told him who I was, that I was calling for our 10:30 appointment, hung up. I had an inkling. Sure enough, about 90 seconds later, he calls me back. He said, Rob, I hope you understand, I get hundreds of calls a day. I switch my cell phone number once a year, and I have to screen every call I take. So not only do you have to understand the customer's problem, you have to understand that these guys are inundated with stuff. And if you're just somebody else hawking their stuff and hounding them, they're not going to respond. You have to position yourself as an innovator. What's the economic impact of the problem? Is it I need to generate more revenue, or is I got to cut more expense? Those are the big picture items. Let me also tell you something I know from dealing with a lot of customers. Cutting expense seldom involves labor savings. Much as you think you might be able to reduce the number of developers or reduce some kind of cost, most professional organizations who have people on salary, not hourly, don't view salaries as something that's relevant. Because if they've really got good people, they're just going to put in the extra hours. Also, most IT organizations, if they have the ability to reduce man hours put into a project, don't turn that into bottom line savings. They redeploy those people on other projects. So it's important you understand in the organization, in the industry you're dealing with, in the organization you're dealing with, how they define revenues and how they define expenses. Also understand most IT organizations are expense only. They don't generate revenue. So the first thing that happens when times get bad is they cut expenses and go find ways to generate more revenue. So if you're dealing with a customer, they have a bad quarter, you're working on expense reduction projects, probably not going to happen. You're working on revenue enhancement projects, they're probably going to put money into it. So know what's going on, what that customer's performance are, and where the money is. How are they addressing the problem today? As I said before, if they're not addressing it, they don't have a problem. If they're not doing something, that something might be a manual fix, that something might be outsourcing the problem, that something might be a team of 12 people working on it. You've got to know what it is. How much competition is doing nothing? So let's talk about each one of these. That's usually the biggest one I run into. I'd rather not do it. Why take the risk? It works today. It's not perfect, but it works today. How does the customer address the problem? Define the problem. What's the specific business problem? Who has it? As I said, what's the impact on business? Is it the ability to generate more revenue or the ability to cut more expense? At some level, it's got to be one of those two, because that's all businesses care about. They either want more revenue or less expense so they can get more profit. If it can't be boiled down to one of those two, you haven't got a good enough problem yet. Who has to fix it? IT, or information technology groups, usually are executors of somebody else's strategy. The sales organization wants to do this. The operations department wants to do this. Manufacturing wants to do this. Saudi Airlines wants to cut on fuel. Southwest Airlines wants to further, optimize its operations. Apple Computer wants to be able to push more products out the door in a given quarter. Who has to fix it? When does it have to be fixed? Is it a 3-month problem, a 6-month problem? Is it on the top 3 things this quarter, the top 3 things this year? Or is it being punted to the following year? All those are qualifying questions. What is the economic impact? Again, is it we missed our numbers? If we missed our revenue number, the first thing that's going to happen is they're, number one, going to cut expenses, and number two, find ways to enhance revenue for the next quarter. If they're making lots of money, they'll be willing to invest in more expense reduction stuff. If they're in a high growth market like we saw, that curve's really steep, they're probably going to work on shipping more product. Understand the business, understand the dynamic, understand what's important to the person you're dealing with. Personnel costs we talk about. Most people don't think of salaried employees as hardcore personnel costs. What are the sunk costs? Sunk costs is a concept quickly. If I've already spent the money's gone. So if you're going to save me money on a sunk cost, the accounting department does not care. If you're going to save me money on a go-forward cost, they will care. So if I already built the production line, it's going to be hard to get me to spend more money on that production line to enhance it. If I'm building a new production line, it's going to be easier to get me to spend more money to get that new production line more efficient than the last one. Does that make sense? So going back and retrofitting something is a tougher sell than showing them how to build something new with less costs. How are they addressing the problem today? They outsourced it. They built a department of 12 people around it. Jane down in shipping uses duct tape and bubble gum to fix it. Somebody hired their son to go in or their daughter to go in and fix it over the summer. How are they fixing it? What's the cost of fixing it? What's the name of the company that's fixing it? If they're using the Acme widget to fix it, that's interesting. What are your 3 favorite things about that Acme widget? If you had the chance, what 3 things would you do to enhance it? Just listen. Don't tell them what Coney does that the Acme widget does. Listen to what they're doing. Are they throwing bodies at the problem? It's such a pervasive problem. We haven't had a chance to catch our breath. I go down to the temp agency and hire people and throw them at it. What kind of savings do they need to see to change? Most organizations have an ROI number they got to get back. They might have a payback period that would say all IT projects or all projects have to pay back in 6 months. It might be 3 months. Your job is to know what that number is and to show them how the payback will happen. How much competition, we're going to close on this one and we'll have you do an exercise. My favorite, how much competition is doing nothing? The dreaded doing nothing. How can you create a sense of urgency, or does a customer have enough sense of urgency to change what they have? If they got mobile apps that are running and they're not perfect, but no one's breathing down their neck, okay, maybe it's time to move on to the next prospect and continue to call them back. But there isn't one organization I deal with or know of that isn't worried about what their mobile presence looks like. And as I gave you with that USAA example, they're more concerned about their mobile presence than they are about their standard web presence. They are investing more to fix their mobile stuff than their standard web stuff. Okay, so a couple points. So everyone who presented didn't say anything about what the Coney solution is. Excellent, right? Don't go in and start talking products until you've earned the right to talk about the product. A lot of good pointers, different ways they picked up information, understanding the business model of the customers, that kind of thing. We're going to move on to the AIM section, and we'll do about the same number of table talks or have people come up. But if you've already spoken, I'd like people who have not, tables who have not yet spoken to speak at the next section. So we get the opportunity to hear from all of you. All right, so that's what I call the ready step. I'm understanding everything about the customer. Now I want to move to the AIM step. I want to move further down the funnel. If in that ready step I have not gotten a high sense of urgency, if they don't understand the impact, I would keep them in the ready end of the funnel. That might mean calling them back every 90 days. That might mean grabbing coffee every 90 days. That might mean listening to the conference call. Could mean any number of things. I want to keep them as a warm lead, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them because they're just not there yet. That sense of urgency isn't identified. It hasn't been articulated yet. So if I move to the AIM phase, I'm going to earn the right to propose something. And again, think of it as this is the equivalent of fast failures. I'm not rejecting them from the system, but in the AIM phase, my time's really valuable. And if I got to have 5 times my annual quota in the pipeline, I'm not going to spend any of it. The AIM time only goes with highly qualified people. Life is a numbers game. If you haven't got enough prospects, you got to find more and spend less time qualifying them. Think of the questions, think of the responses we heard. If they don't have all that stuff listed in MEDIC and what I talked about in Ready, keep them on callback, but don't spend a lot of active time with them. So in AIM, we're earning the right, and we're going to talk about each one of these things. And what do these relate to as far as MEDIC? It relates to the economic buyer, the decision criteria, and the decision process. And let's face it, you guys are dealing with complex products when they get sold. There are multiple buyers. Frequently, IT is going to be the gatekeeper, but it's not necessarily coming out of their budget. So you have to understand all the parties involved. Who are the users? Who's actually going to install it? And those kinds of questions. So let's take a look at that. First of all, how are they fixing the problem today? We've talked about that repeatedly. It's important to keep understanding that. Is it the Acme widget? Is it an outsourced organization? Is it throwing more bodies at the problem? Is it ignoring the problem? Next one. What are the economics of the problem and the current solution? So everyone we heard about from the Ready phase had a well-qualified customer, mostly because they understood the economics, right? Businesses are very rational when it comes to profit making. They want to make more profit. Wall Street is going to hammer them if their profit's not where it's expected. Every quarter, when you're a public company, and I've been in this position, you have to forecast your revenues and forecast your expenses, which leads to profitability. If you're off, the Wall Street term is you get spanked. Right now we're in earnings season. The stock market's going to fluctuate wildly day to day because major corporations are announcing their earnings, and everyone's curious as to whether worldwide economies are recovering or not. So what happens? You get rewarded for accuracy, which means accurate forecast of revenues, accurate forecast of expenses, accurate forecast of earnings. If you make too little money, you will get hurt. If you make too much money, more than forecasted, you will get hurt, meaning your stock price will be pushed down, even if you overperform. So there's heavy emphasis inside these companies for predictability. So knowing whether it's a revenue enhancement or an expense reduction and what's important to them is critical. So what are the economics of the current product and current solution? How are you going to help them? Again, let's go back to that professional salaried employee. Don't rely on that as the overwhelming economic driver, particularly in an IT organization. If they can save 5 people, they're not going to fire those people and have direct economic impact. They're going to redeploy those 5 people onto other projects. It's important you speak that way if you're making an economic argument based on the cost of salaries. A lot of vendors seem to think that if I can do 10% more stuff for 10% less cost, I'm going to win. 10% better, 10% cheaper isn't going to compel most companies to change what they already got. If it's reliable and it's been working and it's not perfect, but it's the devil we know versus the one we don't know, that might not be enough economics. Your job is to go inside and understand their economics. Now, we talked about a couple different businesses, right? We talked about the retail business. Anything that enhances their margin is critical to them. Walmart, one of the largest companies in the United States, they do $500 billion in revenue. Their profit margin is 1.5%. If they can increase that by 10%, they will pay you all kinds of money to do that. But you need to understand what that means. An IT company in Brazil, they're already probably making 10 or 15%. But what they're risking is loss of market share because they don't have the mobility application or the mobile access. So that's a much different argument of economics and current solution than the retailer is. How large is the budget? How large is the budget? What's the budget cycle? Is it coming out of IT? Some organizations choose to budget IT projects out of IT. Some organizations charge them back. If the sales organization wants something, they'll charge through IT back to sales. They'll charge back to manufacturing. Your job is to know what that is. What's the budget cycle? Are they on a calendar year budget cycle and they figure out the budget's September, October? Or are they on a June fiscal end? What if there's a project that has high urgency but hasn't been budgeted? What happens? Listen, this stuff is not easy, right? If it was easy, we wouldn't need a sales organization to close these customers. So I think you had some great, compelling examples of how people were doing things. We obviously heard the best of the best. There's a lot of work that goes into that funnel before they get to this point, but I want you to think back on some of the examples you had here. I will point out to you that, number one, life is not easy in accomplishing anything hard. We looked at some of those examples. You know, look at sports, look at Mark Zuckerberg, look at all the other things we had. You got to keep pushing at it. The other thing, and I think you guys did a very good job of assimilating and applying this, is any good strategy involves, number one, knowing what to do well. In your case, it's selling benefits. And number two, what not to do. And in your case, it's knowing how to qualify a customer and how to get that velocity up on what you're working on. I'm going to be here for lunch. I'm glad to sign your books or answer any questions. My email is on this slide here. It's also in the book, or the website's in the book, which leads to my email. Thank you very much for your time, and let me hand it back over to Blake.